Well, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you for a few minutes today. And what I was hoping to do today is to update this group on the work that Microsoft has done in the year since my colleague John Frank had an opportunity to address you a year ago, as well as to talk about some of our thoughts about what we need to do to be successful in this space going forward. I don't need to convince this group of the real empowerment that technology brings to citizens and communities around the world, whether we're talking about communication, creativity, productivity. There's just such a wide range of ways in which technology can advance the welfare of our citizens, and that with the advent of cloud computing, the opportunity for that is really limitless. But we see and we fear that the dark side of technology can impose limitations on the ability of the world to really benefit from the opportunities of technology. Again, there's no one in this audience who isn't aware of both of these key considerations: nation-state attacks and cybercrime for profit, and how they both are continue to grow and to be very impactful on citizens and communities around the world. And what we've seen in the trend, especially in the last year, is that the lines between these two have continued to blur. As we've seen increasingly that there are, whether you think of them as mercenary organizations, state-controlled organizations, sometimes it's hard, especially for those of us in the private sector, to really know. But we see the same activity groups engaging in espionage activity, in nation-state sponsored attacks, but also in efforts to simply steal money and working in that way. And we see that increasingly among all of the rogue nations that are engaged in activity that we think is reprehensible. And just for a moment to talk about nation-state attacks and the evolution of those attacks, there's a couple of key lessons here. Starting with the early attacks like the DDoS attack on Estonia in 2007, and the Stuxnet attack, which actually showed that a nation-state could reach across a border using cyber and no kinetic effort at all can influence and extend its power and authority across a geographic border to actually disable nuclear centrifuges. And these lessons have been learned by the nation states that engage in these attacks, and you see over time how this has evolved from those kinds of targeted destructions to massive data exfiltration, to the supply chain attacks that we see today becoming much more sophisticated, including things like the NotPetya attack, where the adversaries recognize that by infiltrating the update system of a popular software package, they could quickly gain trust and get their malware distributed broadly throughout an entire country, and then, of course, through all of the commercial enterprises that had activities in that country, causing billions of dollars in economic damage. We see attacks on critical infrastructure and how that continues to evolve and is a significant concern for governments around the world. And then as we get more current evolutions, you've seen things like the evolution of espionage and attacks for a service, with for-profit companies operating quite openly and supplying these kinds of weapons and exploits to governments that don't have the resources to do it themselves. And we now are clearly on the edge of seeing machine learning and AI technologies being brought to bear, not just on the defense side, but on the side of the attackers and what they can do to improve the scope, effectiveness, and power of their attacks. And what's significant about this, and what you see in just slightly over a decade in terms of the evolution of how nations are using cyber to engage in these attacks. And I'm not just talking about the kinds of espionage that are traditional activities of the government that we have to anticipate will continue to be traditional activities of government, but really attacks that harm citizens and enterprises in times of peace. That's something that's really unique, and I've heard many speakers talk about how that's operating under the threshold of armed conflict. But two recent developments are of interest here. One is just this month when a cyber attack against Israel resulted in a kinetic response, with Israel bombing the location from which they had identified that cyber attack by Hamas had emanated. That is a concern, I know, for governments around the world. when will cyber attacks and the influence of cyber attacks result in kinetic responses? It's to see that happening, of course, in reality, raises the visibility of that concern for us all. So what I would like to spend my time today talking about is what is Microsoft doing, what have we done in the past year in our efforts to address these issues, to raise visibility, to encourage dialogue, and to actually encourage action to try to bring a greater sense of security to cyberspace. So one of the things we've done is we've taken action to disrupt nation-state actors. We've actually done this 3 times with legal process and once with a purely technological effort, in which we have now targeted nation-state actors operating from North Korea, from China, most recently from Iran, and probably our most intensive effort has been to wrestle with a nation-state actor from Russia, one that we call Strontium. It's also known as APT-28 or Fancy Bear. But this is the group that was responsible for a lot of the efforts to influence the US presidential election in 2016. The Mueller investigation resulted in a very specific and very interesting indictment against the individuals responsible for some of this activity. But Microsoft has been engaged in a legal battle with Strontium now for a couple of years, starting in 2016, when we saw Strontium registering fake domains using our trademarks and trade names and the trade names of other technology companies as the basis for conducting the infrastructure for a lot of their attacks. And so we went to court, treated this nation-state actor like a botnet, where my team, my digital crimes unit at Microsoft, is really the world leader in disrupting and taking down for-profit cybercrime botnets. And we took the same legal approach, went to court and got orders transferring to our sinkhole this long list of domains that Strontium was using to conduct its operations. And we also constantly watch their operations, and it's called out here. We saw and announced earlier this year the targeting by Strontium of organizations that seem to be associated with the democratic processes in 6 different EU countries. And we notified those targets so they were aware and could take steps to protect themselves. But the activity of Strontium is not focused just on the US, but it's focused on processes around the world. And so what we have managed to do in 12 different times going to court is we've taken down 84 domains used by Strontium, and we actually have one. We just got another order we're about to execute on to take down several more domains by Strontium. We don't pretend that this activity is going to stop what Strontium's doing. They're too well-resourced. They're too much of an important part of the strategy of Russia to engage in this kind of activity. But what it does is it does add some friction. We have seen that Strontium is much less frequently using Microsoft domains as part of its domain structure for its infrastructure, which means that much less frequently our customers are deceived by Strontium into thinking that the communication they're having with those domains is really communication with us or some of the other technology companies that have given us permission to police this activity by this organization on their behalf. So we have had that impact. We've also, as a result, gotten quite a bit of data about the organization that Strontium has effectively compromised. And we've been able to advise those organizations the fact that they have been infected by Strontium so they could take action to clean their environment. But much more needs to be done. This is just our effort to say, what can we do with the relatively limited resources that we have to bring to bear to this effort to try to do some disruption and to let these actors know that we are interested in stopping their activity when they're targeting citizens and enterprises in times of peace. In addition to that activity, of course, as I think you all know, we've been very active on the public policy side, on trying to work to develop the norms and the principles that governments will live by in cyberspace. And there's some reason for progress. There's been progress in the past year and reason for hope. In addition to all of these different, or as part of all of these different efforts that have been engaged in the past year and that are going to be going forward with the 2 different UN processes in later this year and in coming years, we were particularly gratified to have the opportunity to assist the French government in its effort to develop the Paris Call for Trust and Security in Cyberspace. When we heard that the French government was making this effort, we joined with them to advocate for governments, for civil society, and for technology companies around the world to come together and endorse these principles as a step of pulling together a truly multi-stakeholder voice supporting these key principles of cybersecurity. And it's interesting, we did some work to chart out the 9 principles of the Paris Call, because each one of them is derived from a previous governmental statement of some kind about principles or norms of cybersecurity. And it's interesting to see how some of those have been repeated in different ways over the years. Some were relatively new, but we found all 9 of these principles to be key aspects of what we need to do to preserve the security, protect the security of the cyber world. Much more needs to be done. And we are hopeful that we will find the opportunity to join together with other interested parties in a set of communities that will take each of these principles and say, what can we do with each of these principles? What needs to be done to move them forward into international law? What needs to be done so that we can actually have deterrence for those who seek to violate these principles? There's much that needs to be done to make more of the Paris Call and not let it just stop with this endorsement. But the endorsement itself is very important. 65 countries have signed the Paris Call principles, but over 550 different entities between civil society, the technology industry, and governments have signed the Paris Call, the largest multi-stakeholder statement of cybersecurity principles ever. We need to take that momentum and use it to develop more in terms of what we can do to take those principles and make them real and make them effective and not just a statement. And so we're committed to working with other interested parties in developing these communities to continue the discussion and move forward. Because as you could see from that evolution of cyber attacks, the one thing that we know for sure is our adversaries are not spending their time at important conferences like this CyCon conference. They're not spending their time wordsmithing the precise words to be used in stating a norm. They're not spending their time thinking about how do we transfer those norms into effective international law, and how do we then move from international law to actual deterrence. They are simply taking action, and they're evolving quickly, and they're moving quickly. And so as a community, we need to increase the pace of our activity, increase our resolve to combat those adversaries by moving in the appropriate ways, in the ways that we are, with thoughtful discussion, but we need to move forward more quickly into deterrence. And that's why we support the United States Defend Forward effort that it's engaged in with, as we understand it, many allies, because we think that we do need to find a way to create deterrence so that the nation states who today operate with really no consequence whatsoever begin to recognize that misbehavior in cyberspace isn't free, and there's not freedom of action. But with all of this work that we've done and the work we've done to support the Paris Call, the work that we do at Microsoft to work with governments around the world on how we can strengthen cybersecurity, we also recognize that the first responsibility lies with industry. As a domain of conflict, cyberspace is unique. And we heard this from a couple of the keynotes yesterday, because it is the creation of private industry. It is maintained by private industry, and it's evolved by private industry. And that means we also have the responsibility to ensure, to the best of our ability, the security of cyberspace. And so one of the things that we thought we should do, and you heard about this last year, was try to bring together the technology community to endorse core principles of cybersecurity. Because somewhat surprisingly, you did not see the industry itself coming together to agree on core principles. So we established the Cybersecurity Tech Accord. And the Tech Accord, we just asked technology companies to stand up for 4 key principles. First, that we would do what we could with our engineering and our process to protect our users and customers everywhere. Secondly, that we would not support in any way government efforts to develop weapons or launch weapons that target innocent civilians and enterprises in times of peace. Third, that we would work with our customers and governments around the world to increase cybersecurity resiliency. And finally, that we would work together for how we could respond to cyber attacks more quickly and more effectively. And we started with just over 30 signatories to the Tech Accord when it was launched a year ago. And I think John Frank mentioned this at his speech. But today, we have over 106 companies from around the world, from 21 countries, that have endorsed the Tech Accord. And I'm pleased to say, given the leadership of Estonia in the cybersecurity space, that one of the signatories is GuardTime, one of the companies based here in Estonia. But not only do we have 106 signatories, and the number continues to grow as the technology industry recognizes the importance of these 4 key principles, but I'm very gratified to see that that organization has moved beyond something that Microsoft originally inspired to an organization that is acting very much on its own behalf to address key issues of cybersecurity policy and to endorse those that we as a community, a tech community, a global tech community, think should be adopted and expanded globally. And we also are working on what we can do as a technology industry. So for example, right now there's an effort within the Tech Accord to make sure that we all have endorsed our processes for coordinated vulnerability disclosure. So these companies, increasingly, as I meet with governments in North America, South America, Europe, and Asia, I find that governments increasingly are pleased to see that we have now a voice for the technology community on cybersecurity that they can turn to ask and query what does not just a single technology company, but the global technology industry think about these cybersecurity principles. There's one other thing that I want to address in the time I've got remaining, which is the Defending Democracy program. This is a program that my team launched a year ago and that I am really excited about. It was inspired, of course, by the activity we saw of our adversaries attacking democratic principles, and not just in the US, but in France, right after the 2016 election, we saw activity, and in many other countries around the world, we've seen efforts to actually disrupt the democratic process. And I think it's less important to our adversaries that they actually favor a candidate or another candidate. It's more a part of their strategy to simply erode the confidence of the citizens in the democratic process itself, and to create conflict on key issues in the countries where democracy prevails. And we've seen them be incredibly effective with their disinformation campaigns and their other efforts to influence the vote. And we've learned more and more over the last few years about how close the Russian adversaries in particular came to actually impacting the vote in the United States in their efforts to hack the voting systems of the US. So we created the Defending Democracy program focused on these 3 core pillars. What can we do? What can Microsoft do uniquely and bring to the community, to the democracies of the world, to support election integrity, the security of the campaigns themselves, and to combat disinformation? And we started with this thing we called Account Guard. Account Guard was an effort to increase the security of the campaigns, where we told any political campaign, but also a wide variety of associated organizations, that if they were Office 365 customers, so that we had visibility into efforts to attack them, if they signed up for Account Guard, we would notify them of any threatened attack by a nation-state actor or any compromise by a nation-state actor. And in addition to that, we would conduct cybersecurity seminars, we would help the campaigns understand how to operate in a secure way, and we would help them in the event that they were compromised as to how to solve their problem and continue on securely. We started in the United States. We then came to a number of countries in Europe. We went to Australia, India, and we recently expanded to a number of other countries in Europe. We now cover 26 countries. We've had 36,000 separate campaign accounts that have signed up for this Account Guard, and we've made many notifications of nation-state attacks on those organizations. That has been a big success for us, but it isn't nearly enough. And we learned through this process, and if there's one thing that I've been in my career at Microsoft that's really enthused me about the company is our willingness to learn. As we try something and we get feedback and we learn more, then we change. We evolve what we're doing to try to make it more effective. And we did that in this case because we learned that as good as Account Guard was, we were constrained by the fact that Office 365 was too expensive for campaigns, which often operate on very thin budgets, and it was too hard to deploy securely. So we have now announced Microsoft 365 for campaigns. And this is an offering of our commercial Microsoft M365 service, which has all our most advanced security services included, but we are offering it to the same group of organizations associated with campaigns and democracies at our nonprofit price, which is a very, very significant discount. And it's coming pre-configured with wizards that enable even unsophisticated IT staff for campaigns to easily deploy M365 in a highly secure way for the campaign process. And so that's our next step to trying to help protect the campaign process itself. And that's being launched now this summer, initially in the United States, but again, we expect to make it available in many other democracies around the world. And while I'm excited by that, because I think it will help us help protect campaigns, we've spent the last year working on a project that we just announced to really protect the vote itself, a program that we call Election Guard. And Election Guard is an open source, free software development kit that we're going to make available as a project on GitHub for everyone to help us evolve it, to improve it, to make it more effective. But what Election Guard is a software development kit that enables the application of sophisticated technology to provide a verifiable encrypted vote, so that the voter goes to the polling place and votes, and their vote is encrypted, and that encryption is maintained, the vote gets counted, the voter gets a receipt that they can then use to go online and check and see that their vote was properly counted and was not tampered with. But more importantly than that, the SDK enables voting officials, voting watchdogs, journalists, or other interested parties to build their own verifier app based on the SDK so that they can look to see that the vote was properly counted and not tampered with. Now, the combination of encryption and the other security features we're building into the SDK should make it very hard for an adversary to hack the system. But we know that very hard and absolute are two different things. We don't pretend that it's not hackable. But what we are certain of is that if there's an effort to tamper with the vote or the vote count, using Election Guard, that effort will be visible and known to the election officials. And in the way that we are proposing it, there would be paper ballot backup that could be used. You could do a risk limiting audit, which is supported by the SDK, or just actually count paper ballots to ensure the integrity of the vote. We're going to be making this available, as I said, as an open source free effort this summer. And this summer we will also be creating and providing for public inspection a demonstration prototype of the kind of very simple voting machine that can be created from off-the-shelf inexpensive components to enable this to occur so that it's less expensive for voting officials, it's much, much more secure, and it's also more accessible because we can use this with accessibility components so that people who are challenged by using paper ballots today will have the ability to vote and then confirm the accuracy of their vote. I'm sorry, just very quickly, a video on this topic.
That suggested that a majority of the country did not have confidence that in fact votes would be counted and counted accurately.
Voter participation is about confidence in the vote and to be able to cast your vote and know that it was being counted properly. The Election Guard technology starts with our software development kit. The voter's vote remains encrypted throughout the process.
In addition to printing your ballot, it prints a ballot tracker that has on it a cryptographic code.
Any interested party can take our open source technology and look at the vote as a whole and verify that it was properly accounted.
There's so much passion around these issues, and watching that come together to actually improve our security, it's extraordinary.
So I'm out of time, but with all of this work that we've done and that all of you in this room have done, looking to the future, we, Microsoft, remain committed to our efforts to advance the cause of cybersecurity, defining the right public policy, the right rules of law to apply, the right ways of having a consensus across the cybersecurity community as to what rules of government should apply and how we can deter the rogue nations that insist on violating those rules. We will continue to apply our technology and our advocacy to these goals. And I really appreciate all the effort by the organization here to maintain this conference, which is one of the best conferences to bring together so many different voices around the world to share our information. The panels yesterday were great. I look forward to the ones today, and I thank you for your time.